The sun had already dipped beneath the horizon when Eleanor Caldwell sat alone in the vast study of her father's mansion. The shelves stretched to the ceiling, lined with every book money could buy, but not a single one seemed to help her. She had just returned from another failed exam, mathematics this time, and though she had tried her best, the red mark of failure on the paper felt like a scar on her very identity. Eleanor was the daughter of Richard Caldwell, a man whose name was etched into the fabric of wealth and influence. Her father was not simply a billionaire. He was a man who believed that success was inherited, that intelligence and status passed down as effortlessly as the family crest engraved on their silver spoons. But Eleanor was different. Despite every private tutor, every resource at her disposal, she couldn't seem to keep up. Exams terrified her, words blurred, numbers twisted. She studied for hours, but when it mattered, her mind collapsed beneath the weight of expectation. Her father's disappointment was an ever-present storm, and each failure only intensified his silent judgment. The mansion grew colder each time she walked through the door with another poor result. She knew what people whispered, that she was spoiled, unintelligent, proof that wealth could not buy wisdom. That evening, as Eleanor's head sank into her hands, a faint sound caught her attention, the rhythmic sweep of a broom. She turned and saw him through the open door of the study, James Carter, the janitor. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with skin as dark as polished mahogany, his posture shaped by years of quiet labor. Most of the family barely acknowledged him, as though he were part of the marble floors he cleaned. But Eleanor noticed. She had always noticed. James had worked for the Caldwells for years, taking the late-night shifts no one else wanted. He rarely spoke unless spoken to, but his eyes carried a kind of stillness that unsettled those who judged him too quickly. To Eleanor, those eyes carried stories, untold, unshared, but full of life. That night, she surprised herself when she called out softly, "Mr. Carter?" He paused, leaning on the broom, and stepped into the light. "Yes, Miss Eleanor?" Her voice shook. How do you keep going? You work so hard, every night. And you never seem tired of failing." The words slipped out before she realized their cruelty, but James didn't flinch. Instead, he studied her for a long moment, then gave a faint smile. "Failure," he said slowly, "is only a word for those who give up before they learn what it means to stand again." Eleanor blinked. His words were simple, but they cut through her despair like glass through silk. She had expected a lecture, maybe silence, but not this. For the first time in weeks, she felt curious. "Were you ever like me?" she asked. "Always behind, always disappointing people." James looked away, as if weighing the choice of memory against silence. Then he set the broom aside and lowered himself into one of the leather chairs, though he did it with the respect of someone who wasn't sure he belonged there. "I grew up in the South," he began, his voice low but firm. "My school was falling apart, cracked windows, torn books if we had any. The world told me I wasn't supposed to succeed, because I was black, because my father was gone, because we lived in a neighborhood that people drove through with their windows rolled up. Every teacher I had, except one, looked at me and saw statistics. Failure, prison, an early grave. But I had something they didn't know about. I had a secret." Eleanor leaned forward. "A secret?" James nodded. "Yes, a way of seeing the world that no one could take from me. See, when the world tells you you're nothing, you learn to listen to something else. You learn to build your strength in silence, to find patterns where others only see chaos. I studied not just what was in the books, but the way the world itself was teaching me. And that made me stronger than any test." Eleanor frowned. "But I've tried. I study for hours, and it never works. I feel stupid." James shook his head. "You are not stupid, child. You are carrying a burden. You are trying to climb a mountain while believing you don't belong at the top. That belief breaks more people than ignorance ever will." His words landed heavy in her chest. For years she had thought the problem was her brain, her lack of ability. But what if it was her fear? What if her father's constant disappointment had carved doubts so deep into her mind that she had stopped believing in herself before she even began? "Will you teach me?" she whispered, surprising herself again. James studied her face. He saw not the spoiled daughter of a billionaire, but a young woman lost inside expectations too heavy for her shoulders. He nodded once. "If you're willing to listen, not just with your ears, but with your heart." And so the lessons began. They met at night in the mansion's forgotten library where dust-coated books no one had touched in decades. James never used the expensive materials her tutors brought. Instead, he taught Eleanor how to break problems into pieces so small they lost their power. He showed her how to breathe before reading a question, how to steady her hands when panic set in. He shared stories of his own failures, exams he had flunked, jobs he had lost, until Eleanor realized that failing was not the end but a beginning. Knowledge, James told her, isn't about memorizing answers. It's about learning to ask the right questions. A test measures how you think when the world presses down on you. So we'll train not just your mind, but your spirit. For the first time in her life, Eleanor didn't dread learning. She laughed at her mistakes. She asked questions. She began to see patterns in numbers, rhythms in words. And in the quiet glow of the library lamp, she began to believe in herself, not as her father's daughter, not as the failure people whispered about, but as Eleanor. But the walls of wealth were not kind to such transformations. Richard Caldwell noticed the change in his daughter, and suspicion grew. Who was teaching her? What influence crept into his house without his permission? To him, James Carter was invisible, a man whose work ended with the mop and broom. The idea that his daughter could learn from a janitor, a black man no less, was unthinkable. And yet, Eleanor knew that if she was to rise, she would need to keep listening to James, because his secret was not only about exams, it was about dignity, about finding strength in the very places the world tried to break you. The weeks passed quietly, and Eleanor's world began to change. Her nights in the dusty library with James became a sanctuary, a place where she could breathe without the weight of her father's expectations. James had a way of turning even the hardest lessons into something alive. He would take a math problem and relate it to rhythms in music, or explain history through the stories of people who fought, resisted, and refused to bow. His lessons were not about facts, they were about resilience. One night, after a particularly long study session, Eleanor leaned back in her chair. "Why don't people know about you?" she asked softly. "You're brilliant, James, smarter than any tutor I've ever had." James gave a slow, knowing smile. "Brilliance isn't always about who's the loudest in the room, Eleanor. Sometimes it's about who survives long enough to pass wisdom on. This world doesn't always give men like me the stage, but it doesn't mean we don't carry the light." His words struck her. She had grown up in a world where power was measured in money, where influence was inherited, and where voices like James's were often silenced before they could even be heard. And yet here he was, shaping her life in ways no one else could. The breakthrough came one cold winter evening. Eleanor had an exam in literature, a subject she always dreaded. Her tutors had called her hopeless, too distracted, too fragile. But James sat across from her at the old oak table, his deep voice steady. "Close your eyes," he said. "Stop thinking about the test. Imagine the story you're about to read as if you are living it. Step inside the words. Smell the air, feel the tension, hear the voices. Don't just study, live it." When she opened her eyes and tried again, the words on the page no longer blurred. They became real, alive, connected. She answered each question with clarity she never knew she had. For the first time in her life, Eleanor left the exam hall not with dread, but with quiet confidence. And when the results came, she passed. It was not perfect, barely above average, but to Eleanor, it was everything. She ran back to the mansion, paper in hand, her heart pounding. James was in the hall, polishing the brass fixtures. She held the paper out to him with tears streaming down her face. "I passed," she whispered. James looked at the score, then at her, and for the first time since she had known him, his eyes softened into pride. "This is just the beginning," he said. But not everyone shared that pride. Richard Caldwell soon discovered the change in his daughter's grades. At first, he assumed it was luck, or that one of the tutors had finally broken through. But when Eleanor's marks began to rise consistently, his curiosity grew. One evening at dinner, he asked, "Which of your tutors has finally managed to get through to you?" Eleanor froze. She thought about telling the truth, but she knew what her father would say. He would dismiss James, maybe even fire him. She forced a smile. "Just studying harder, Father." But Richard Caldwell was not a man easily deceived. The next night, he left his study door ajar and waited. He listened as Eleanor crept into the library and as James's low voice carried through the corridor. When Richard entered the room and saw his daughter sitting with the janitor, his fury was immediate. "What is the meaning of this?" His voice thundered, filling the library like a crack of lightning. Eleanor jumped to her feet. "Father, please!" Richard's face hardened as his gaze locked on James. "You, out, now!" James stood slowly, his eyes steady. He didn't cower, didn't beg. He simply gathered the few books on the table and set them neatly aside. "With respect, sir," he said calmly, "your daughter asked me to help her, and she has worked harder than anyone gives her credit for." Richard's face flushed with anger. "You are a janitor. You clean floors. How dare you presume to teach my child? You think you can offer her something her tutors cannot? This is a disgrace." Eleanor stepped forward, her voice trembling. "He's the only one who believed in me! You pay tutors thousands!" "But none of them saw me." "He did. He taught me how to think, how to believe in myself." Her father's hand slammed down on the table. "Enough! I will not have this house disgraced! You are a Caldwell. You will be taught by professionals, not a janitor." The venom in his voice hung in the air, dripping with the prejudice Eleanor had heard all her life. To Richard, James was invisible, a man whose only value lay in silence and servitude. James met his gaze, unshaken. "You can call me what you like, sir. I've been called worse. But your daughter is learning. That's what matters." Richard's voice turned cold. "Pack your things. You are finished here." Eleanor cried out, "No! You can't fire him!" But Richard Caldwell's decision was final. That night, James was dismissed from the mansion, his broom and mop left behind in the hallway, as if he had never existed. Eleanor's heart broke. She ran after him, catching him just as he stepped through the iron gates. "James, please," she begged. "I can't do this without you." He placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "Yes, you can, because now you know the secret. It was never me, Eleanor. It was you. You only needed someone to remind you of the strength you already carried." Tears blurred her vision. "But what if I fail again?" James's smile was faint but certain. "Then you rise again. Failure is not the end. Remember that." And then he was gone, swallowed by the night. The days that followed were brutal. Her father replaced James's presence with stricter tutors, heavier schedules, harsher rules. But Eleanor no longer listened to their voices. She carried James's lessons inside her, the rhythm of breathing before panic took hold, the courage to step inside a story, the belief that she belonged. Her exams came one by one, and though the pressure grew, Eleanor held her ground. She passed another, then another. Each time she whispered James's words to herself, "Failure is not the end." But whispers only carried so far. The world outside the mansion was waiting. Soon, Eleanor would face the greatest test of all, not in a classroom, but in proving to her father, and to herself, that the secret James had given her was more powerful than all the wealth in the world. Spring arrived with the weight of expectation. Eleanor was preparing for her final exams, the ones that would determine whether she could move forward in her education. or remain the failure everyone had branded her. For her father, this was not merely about her academic success. It was about family reputation, about proving that the Caldwell name remained untarnished. But for Eleanor, this was no longer about her father's approval. This was about James, about honoring the man who had believed in her when no one else would. On the morning of her most difficult exam, advanced mathematics, Eleanor sat at her desk in the exam hall, her hands trembling. Around her, students scribbled, their pens scratching furiously against the paper. Her mind, for a brief moment, went blank. The numbers twisted again, threatening to drown her in the same panic she had always felt. But then she closed her eyes. She heard James's voice, calm and steady. Break it down. Piece by piece. Breathe. You don't need to conquer the mountain all at once. Just take the next step. She inhaled deeply, exhaled, then opened her eyes. Slowly, the numbers untangled, falling into patterns she could see, rhythms she could follow. She worked steadily, methodically, refusing to let fear take her. When she reached the final question, her heart surged, not with panic, but with determination. She finished the paper and set down her pen with quiet dignity. Weeks later, the results came. Eleanor had not only passed, she had excelled. Her marks placed her among the top of her class. It was a triumph she had never imagined possible. She rushed home, ready to share the news with her father, to finally see pride in his eyes. Richard Caldwell sat in his grand study, reviewing investment reports when Eleanor burst in. "Father," she said breathlessly, "I did it. I passed. Not just passed, I scored near the top." She placed the paper on his desk, her voice trembling with hope. Richard glanced at the results, his brow lifting slightly. For a moment, Eleanor thought she saw pride. But then his face hardened again. "This," he said coldly, "is the result of discipline, of finally listening to the tutors I've paid for. It is proof that you were wasting time before." Eleanor's heart sank. He couldn't see it. He couldn't see James. She swallowed her anger, but deep inside, a resolve grew. This was no longer about proving herself to her father. This was about carrying forward the dignity James had given her. That summer, Eleanor did something unthinkable for a Caldwell. She applied for a volunteer program in a community school on the other side of the city, a school where children, much like James had once been, were told they would never amount to anything. She wanted to share what she had learned. Not formulas, not memorized facts, but the secret James had given her: resilience, dignity, the courage to rise. The first day she entered the crumbling classroom, the children eyed her with suspicion. To them, she was a rich girl, out of place among broken desks and peeling paint. But Eleanor didn't try to dazzle them with wealth or titles. She sat among them, shared her own failures, her panic, her tears. She told them about the janitor who had changed her life. And slowly, the children leaned in. They listened. Because her story was not about privilege, it was about being seen, about being believed in, even when the world had already judged you. Word of her work spread, and soon reporters came. They wanted to know why the daughter of a billionaire was spending her summer in a forgotten school. Eleanor stood before their cameras, her voice steady. "Because someone believed in me when I was at my lowest," she said. "And he wasn't a tutor or a professor. He was a janitor. A black man the world overlooked. But he carried more wisdom than any textbook. He taught me that failure is not the end, that dignity cannot be bought, and that true teaching is about belief, not status." Her words echoed far beyond the school walls. For the first time, people began asking, who was this janitor? What was his story? And somewhere, in a modest apartment across town, James Carter sat watching the news. He had returned to quiet work in another building, sweeping floors, emptying bins. But when he saw Eleanor standing there, speaking his lessons to the world, his eyes filled with quiet tears. He had not been erased after all. His voice had found its way through her. Richard Caldwell, however, was furious. The family name was splashed across headlines, linked to a story he wanted buried. He confronted Eleanor that evening, his anger sharp. "You are humiliating this family," he thundered. "Do you understand the damage you are doing? Praising a janitor as if he were a savior, do you know how this looks?" Eleanor stood tall. For the first time in her life, she did not shrink beneath his voice. "It looks like the truth," she said firmly, "and I will not hide it. He saved me, and nothing you say will erase that." Her father stared at her, stunned by her defiance. For years, Eleanor had bent beneath his expectations. But now she stood unbroken, her strength born not of wealth, but of wisdom. Months later, Eleanor was invited to speak at a university event on education and resilience. She stood before professors, students, and dignitaries, and once again told her story, not as the failure she had once been, but as the woman who had learned the secret of rising. And then, with trembling hands, she revealed her greatest surprise. "In the audience today," she said, her voice breaking, "is the man who made this possible. A man who the world dismissed as invisible, but who taught me everything about dignity and strength. Please welcome Mr. James Carter." The hall erupted in applause as James, humble as ever, walked slowly to the stage. He tried to shake his head, as if he didn't belong, but Eleanor took his hand and pulled him forward. For the first time, James was not a shadow sweeping hallways. He was seen, honored, his story lifted into the light. And though he spoke only briefly, I just shared what life had taught me. His presence was a thunderous reminder that wisdom does not wear a suit, and dignity does not bow to wealth. Eleanor never forgot that night. Nor did the students, or the children from the school, or the countless viewers who later watched the speech online. The story spread across communities, across divides, a reminder that brilliance can come from the most unexpected places. And as Eleanor looked out over the crowd, her father's stern face among them, she knew the truth at last. She had not simply passed her exams. She had inherited something far greater than wealth, James's secret, the power to rise, to resist, to carry dignity no matter what the world said. The billionaire's daughter had failed every exam until the black janitor taught her the secret, and because of him, she would never fail herself again.